Hi, everybody. Welcome to our keynote reading on the last weekend of Culturama. It's Saturday evening. We're here for Shonda Buchanan. And I just want to remind everybody that if you'd like to follow us, you can go to our community page, and I will put the link in the thing in a second, but here it is. And somehow Tom Thomas has become the random face of that. And we've got up already this morning's post, so you can see Shonda. Again, if you missed Shonda this morning, you can see her on tape. And if you'd like to follow us throughout the year as we continue Culturama throughout the year, that's how to follow us. That's the best way to follow us. And I'll put that up in a second. But today we have Shonda Buchanan, who I see a lot of my students are here and to be a part of it. And that's because I'm using her book in my English 1C class, and it's been just absolutely wonderful. It's it's an extraordinary memoir, and well, I'll let her describe it to you. So, Shonda Buchanan.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, John, for asking me to be the keynote and for buying my book, for your class, for having your class buy my book. I'm incredibly grateful, and to everyone at my favorite college in California, Mount SAC. Yeah, I miss it. I miss it over there. There's something really special about that campus. So I'm going to start in a couple of different ways, as if I was at a podium. And when I'm usually giving this kind of a reading, because my book is about recovering and reclaiming ancestors, I like to start with a song. I will move into a poem. So don't be afraid. Don't think as if I'm like, oh, what's happening with her? Why is she in a trance? I'm just going to go ahead and get into the reading. Okay. And then I'm going to screen share. John, if you can give me screen share privileges, I'm just going to show a couple of family images and talk a little bit about those as well as I do the reading. So for those of you who haven't read my book, Black Indian talks about ancestry, it talks about identity, it talks about landscape and loss. I was born in Kalamazoo, Michigan. I researched my heritage back to at least 13 generations that I know of. So from my research and from my family oral history and narrative, I am, of course, African. I'm 13th generation Kahari, Eastern Band Cherokee, Delaware Cherokee, also Choctaw on my dad's side. And so I set myself on this mission of kind of reclaiming that American Indian heritage. And we might have to mute the mics because I hear someone's mic on. And then I'll unmute myself. We're good? Okay. You can hear me now. And I learned this in Chumash Children's honoring song, which we are on Chumash land, we're on Tanva land here in California, Gabrielano, and there are several other nations, the coastal nations. So I want to sing this song in honor of the people of this land and also for the children, for my ancestors. And oh, this is a story behind this rattle, but hopefully I'll remember to share it. Hey, ya, 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 yo. Way, ya, ya, yo. Way, ya, ya, yo. Way, yo. Way, yo. Way, way, ya, hey, yo. Way, ya, ya, yo. Way, ya, yo. Way, ya, yo. Way, yo. Way, yo. Way, way, ya, hey, yo. Yeah, yo. Way, yo. Way, yo. Way, yo. Way, yo. away, 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 ah, hey, oh. Black Indians. All my journeys begin in North Carolina without my knowing it. Black Indians pushed like September crab shells on an angry winter shore, swept up in the Moby Dick's adventure. The literature of us wiped and creamed against an outcrop of colonizing rocks, our acorn, our buckskin, our dreaming crushed, no corrected. Under the weight of change, we became husks of ourselves. We were Nusayuk fading into Kahari ghosts on a riverbank. We were red-black wolves chewing our wrists from the arm. We fought next to the Tuscarora, beating ourselves into a story of lush rivers and swampland and defeat, unaware of the coming. Saddles and horses and silver and white mouths, sweeping us up in their fingers like dust in the corner of black powder pouches. We ran. My family escaped from that swampland in Sampson County into Tennessee, into Indiana, and then finally Michigan, where I was born. Indian, mulatto, colored, black. What were we? We planted ourselves next to the Potawatomi and the Odawa like corn stalks, and we grew into a farmhouse on fire. So that poem is from this book, Who's Afraid of Black Indians? And it was one of the books that I started writing in the middle of writing my memoir, Black Indian. I needed to kind of get it out. You know, I didn't even know if this book would be published because of, someone called it a dark memoir, quote unquote. And I was like, what's that? You know, because I'm dark, I'm Black, and what does that mean? And then other people said, well, I don't know if they're looking for memoirs about Black women who have suffered abuse. We've done that before. I've heard so many things. And so I pulled some of the poems or some of the actions out of this book and just my experiences and the history. And I put together Who's Afraid of Black Indians, which is one of my first collections of poetry, but I continued writing Black Indian. And whether or not my ancestors are proud, no one's visited me in my dreams and berated me. I think that they're proud that I actually had a chance and the courage, I think, and the bravery to tell a story that hadn't been told before, right? To uncover a landscape and a narrative that hadn't been told before. I think a lot of African Americans, I say a lot because we say this in our communities, but a lot of us will say, oh, I've got American Indian in me. I've got American Indian blood. And we're proud of that. But there's a whole history. There's a cultural precept behind this feeling of being, quote unquote, Black and then proud of that American Indian ancestry without knowing the history of those actual intersections. And so a part of writing Black Indian was about getting to the core of that for my family. And then also, I guess, for the community, for Black folks in the community, but then our country, right? Because we're not just, for me, we're not just African American. We're not just African Americans with American Indian blood. We also have European ancestry. We also have that European blood. And the DNA tells the story as well. So a part of Black Indian was about kind of, trying to figure out what does this mean to have these multiple bi and triraciality ethnicities flowing in my blood, but then also secrets, the secrets behind it. So I'm going to start with this chapter, and then I'm going to show a couple of images and talk about some of my lovely family, elders, ancestors now. Wait. To tell you any of these stories, I have to tell you the first, the very first. Somewhere in Matawan, Michigan, there is an infant buried on top of a 13-year-old girl's grave. The infant, stillborn, was given a name anyway, but the syllables has her name buried under its cool tongue. The child's sutured eyes and never-kissed lips greeted that 1950s winter sky, the color of heron wings, when her father, my grandfather, opened another hole in the mute earth and laid his second unforgiving child's body to rest in her slender arms. Finally, someone to hold. My Aunt Frida shifted and yawned into the earth. Together there, my two aunts, the virgin and the infant, kept each other safe. And they shared the secret of each other's bones. And there were lots of secrets. Maybe I am the unborn child. Perhaps she returned in me to tell our story from my woman child's hands, Velma Jean's daughter's hands, fourth girl child's hands, since we are, after all, the baby girls and the sixth seed. We both prefer the dint of rain in the earth to the din of voices, the fists, the liquor laugh screams at family gatherings. Equally, we cherished our silence. And if I am her, what did I see hovering over the farm before the last mound of dirt covered me? What would I say first? Maybe something about the Potawatomi, the Odawa, and the Ojibwe building wigwams on riverbanks before French trappers, missionaries, and settlers came. Something about Mama's cornbread and Daddy's cold beer. The 5 little burnished yellow Matawan fairies, mulatto skin, Pocahontas eyes. I would take you to the fields, to Wolf Lake, to the bait house, push you on the tire swing laced to the top branch of the weeping willow in the front yard, push you until you were dizzy. And then I would say it. What I don't know, I can't tell. So that's the first chapter of my memoir. And it's interesting. I gave my mom a copy of my memoir before it was published. And I said to her, actually, I'll go back. I actually had been writing this for about 3 or 4 years. And I went to my mom and I was like, Mommy, I'm writing the good and the bad of the family. And she's like, what? I said, I'm writing the family story. Got to say it in different ways. Like, I'm writing about the family, Mom. And so she was like, okay, so I guess she accepted it. And then I gave her the manuscript when it was finished, just like holding on to my, my name and just shivering. My family is a hard family. We're not afraid to, people are not afraid to bop us in the head in my family, no matter how old you are. And so she gave it to her and waited about a week. And I said, Mommy, did you read it? And she said, well, yeah, but you spelled your Aunt Catherine's name wrong. And that was the only feedback she gave to me. And I felt a couple of things. Yay, my mom, the most important person in this story, read it, and she's okay with me putting the family story out there. She saw the research I did. She can see the work that I did it. Poetic language, apparently, she was a reader anyway. So she never really discussed any of the things in the book. Even now to this day, when I sent her a copy, she carries my book around with her, literally, and people are like, what is that? She's like, my daughter wrote this book. And but I don't even know if she's cracked the pages. And I know why. I know that she and my sister Rochelle, who the story is also about, I know that there are things that happened in the past that they don't want to revisit, but they wanted people to hear their stories. Like, they wanted people to know. And my sister said that on multiple times too. She's like, I wish somebody would tell my story. And finally, I was one of the ones who happened to be able to do that as a writer, as a person now who is quote unquote the keeper of the family history, of the family lore. And these Staffords here that you see on the screen are one of the beginnings of the branches of my family. So this is one of my great aunts, Mary Stafford. And this is her family. This is the Staffords in the Haywoods. But this whole family tree starts from the Stafford side with this gentleman here, Jeremiah Stafford Sr. Yes, he looks like Abe Lincoln. I do not know why. I don't know if he adopted. I have in my mind that Mormons have this look, but so I don't know if he adopted Mormonhood or Quakerhood or anything along those lines. I just know his image just seems so just familiar, to me in that the sense of men of that time. But we didn't know anything about his story. My mom, when I started researching and I started saying, "Hey, Mama, did you know that one of your great great grandfathers, Jeremiah Stafford, was born in North Carolina?" And she's like, "No, I didn't know any of that." And I was like, why do you not know? How do you not know? And so I was like, okay, so what was the family? How did he get from North Carolina to Kalamazoo? Like how did that happen from Sampson County, North Carolina, or Halifax? And my apologies, the Staffords came from Halifax and Hertford, North Carolina, and my Manuels came from Sampson County, North Carolina. And then my Matthews came from a different part, like a little sliver between North Carolina and Virginia. So I was like, how did he get here? And so a part of writing this book became about tracing his family heritage. He married his, to my understanding, first wife when she was 13. Her name was Annie Millam Stafford. And Annie Millam proceeded to have 15 kids for this man. And my grandfather, my apologies, my great grandfather, Jeremiah Stafford, and I'm going to share a different screen. Okay, so this gentleman here, oh, where's my present? There it is. So the man that you saw, Jeremiah Stafford, this is the last boy, Jason Stafford, and this is my great great grandfather, and this is his wife, Caldonia Stafford. But Caldonia is actually a Roberts, and her people, the Roberts, settled some of the first land, or I guess I'll say townships in Indiana. And you can actually Google the Roberts settlement. It was made a national historic site. The church where they first built the church and the community in Indiana was like Roberts settlement, Nettle Creek settlement, a couple of other settlements. But this family just really just has an incredibly strong history in Indiana. But that history, of course, goes back to North Carolina as well. And this little gentleman right here is my grandfather. This is Clifford Stafford. And you can see that no one looks really happy in this picture. So I was always, this is kind of one of the images where I was like, what are they thinking, right? As a writer, you use your pictures, you use your family photos to unearth some information. But of course, as a creative nonfiction writer, you're also just kind of doing maybe they were thinking this, right? You're kind of putting the possibility of thoughts into their head based upon either the lore, things that you have been told, things that you haven't been told, right? And so for me, when I look at this image of my great great grandfather, which is so interesting that I'm only 3 people removed from him, Jason Stafford, and then I look at Caldonia, or Callie D, what you called her, and I'm like, okay, someone's playing, or maybe they don't really want to take this picture. It took a long time to get there. And my grandfather, Clifford Stafford, Grandpa, looks so darn sad. So I realized I had to ask questions, and when I finally did, what was told to me was that Jason was someone who basically used to whip or take out things on my grandfather, on Clifford Stafford, and my great grandmother, Callie D, was always trying to protect Clifford. And so apparently, this is what was told to me, right? And I do talk about this in the memoir as well. And so when I talk about secrets in the book, one of the secrets that I didn't know, that we suffered from a kind of legacy of abuse. Like I didn't know that at all. And I'm going to go back to this. So what happened was, and you'll see some of this in the book as well, but my mom essentially had some of the same kinds of experiences that this gentleman had, that my grandpa had in her own life. And it was really hard to talk about it. So, in uncovering the family history, I was so lucky to be able to come back to some of these photos. Like this is this is Callie, Frances Callie D as well. This is with some of her other family members. This is my great aunt Catherine, who, when I really first started researching the family history, and I went back for a funeral, which I talk about in the book. But my great aunt Catherine basically said to me when I asked her the question, "Hey, Aunt Catherine, I'm writing about the family. Would you talk to me about what it, about maybe our Indian heritage or, what do you remember? What do you know?" And my great aunt Catherine proceeded to tell me that she would not share her family history with me, and froze me cold. And I said, "Wait, aren't we family? Aren't you my aunt? Aren't you my auntie?" And she's like, "I'm not talking about my family with you." I was like, "Okay, all right." So that means I have to do the work. And I'm going to read this little section where I'm talking a little bit about what I actually uncovered. Even though I did have her help in the family tree, she would not speak to me about it. "You know you got some Indian in you," my mother proudly crooned every 6 months or so when I was growing up. How did she know? Her Aunt Catherine, our family historian, told her. Mama's father told her. Her cousins and uncles told my mom and aunt stories about being from a tribe in Mattawan, but later her dad said Oklahoma, yet none of them did the research. My research uncovered a route. We were migration trail transplants from the eastern shores that lined the edges of the first counties that formed the Union. My mother's great grandpa Manuel married Ida Mahoney, and Ida's mom, Mariah Ann Peake, is listed on a family photograph as full blood Cherokee. But a later pedigree chart from my great aunt Catherine lists Mariah Annie Peake as both Delaware Indian and Pequot Indian born in Oklahoma. I never found that line. I'm still searching for that actual line and whether or not she's on the Dawes rolls, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. The Manual men were full or mixed blood Kahari or Noose Indians from Sampson County, North Carolina. They'd either married Indian or Black or mixed race women like Ida. My great aunt Catherine was the first to handwrite a family tree that showed the names and the dates and the ethnicities in her spider-like scrawl. And I traced the rest like an explorer, using her genealogical treasure map.
5:30.
Okay, I have time.
You have time.
Whatever you want.
My mom's grandmother, Caldonia Frances Stafford Roberts, was a Robert by birth, was 1/4 Cherokee. Caldonia, also known as Callie D, was a descendant of that Robert settlement, one of the first free people of color settlements in Indiana in 1830. And theirs was a mixed race and bi and triracial community of light, bright people who traded with the Quakers. The Roberts family lore has it that the patriarch, James Roberts, was born in the mid 1700s, was the son of an American Indian mother and a free African servant father, but he was never a slave. Descriptions of James, a free person of color who owned and sold over 700 acres of land between 1765 and 1809 in Northampton County, North Carolina, confirm his ethnicity. And while the family reported James' mother was Cherokee, she could very well have been Tuscarora or Nottoway or Meherrin, as those were the predominant tribes in that area at the time. And because of the shared experiences in colonial America, interracial marriages between African Americans and American Indians in the 17 and 1800s were the norm. despite the prohibitive anti-miscegenation laws. Okay, so I'm going to pause there because I introduced you to that side of the family, the Roberts family, but I'm going to talk about, I mentioned three things in here, just in this little section. So I mentioned the free people of color, and free people of color is a term that was created, I guess you could say, actually, the free people of color term was created around the 1700s. And it was created because they needed to isolate and identify who technically was not a slave. And but at the same time, they were still kind of classifying like Indian tribes. Of course, supposedly the first Africans who came to the New World, quote unquote, New World, to the Americas happened in 1619. And those first 20 Africans came to Jamestown. First 20 Africans on that ship who came to Jamestown, they technically were slaves, but they could also be baptized out of slavery, which is a totally different experience from the 1800s, but I'll come back to that. So this is when you have some of the first intersections and the mingling and the mixing and the marrying of the Africans, the American Indians, and the Europeans. It was kind of it was a normalcy to see that until they started creating these laws and they started prohibiting, slave masters' children the ability to inherit the slave master's property. They also passed laws to say any child born of a slave woman would also be a slave, which was a convenient way of saying even though you've got a mixed blood or a mulatto child, even though that child is half white, that child will not inherit the father's property, right? So some marriages were happening in secret. African Americans at the time weren't called African Americans, but Black people and American Indians could help each other. They could marry. Africans did run away to some Indian villages. That's another way that they had the intersection. The intersection was created as well. Another really traumatic intersection for African Americans and American Indians in this country happened on the Trail of Tears. And I don't know how many of you know about the Trail of Tears. Maybe I could just do a show of hands. How many of you know about the Trail of Tears? And okay, yeah. So the 5 civilized tribes, quote unquote, the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Creek, the Seminole, and the Choctaw, to make whites feel better about encroaching upon their lands, they started adopting their ways and they started cutting their hair, right? And they wearing Western clothing and to the best of their ability, living alongside white people, learning the language and owning slaves. And so I talk about this in my book as well, but the Cherokee Nation, when, my apologies, back up. So the 5 civilized tribes did own the slaves, and we have a famous president, Andrew Jackson, who was considered, they called him the Indian killer. And so he fought a lot of the early wars, the Indian wars. And he was also the orchestrator, or he drew up the plans for the Indian removal for the Trail of Tears, which actually started in 1728. A lot of the records show 1730, but it really started in 1728 when they started removing those nations from their lands in the southeast, from South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, and pushing them and pushing them and pushing them and putting them on the trail and yanking them out of their homes. This literally happened from 1728 to 1732, and putting them on ships and marching them across the country into Mississippi and Mississippi and then Oklahoma. And so, I'm sorry, Oklahoma, Mississippi, a little bit of Mississippi, but really Alabama. And Oklahoma technically now, it was known as Indian Territory. So basically it was like, we're going to take you from your own homeland, but we're going to create another homeland for you, and you're going to be happy with that. So when the 5 civilized tribes were on that trail, they took their slaves with them. And a lot of people, it was incredibly traumatic. and harmful. The Trail of Tears was another level of disruption and displacement for American Indians, but it was also a moment of erasure because for erasure for the nations themselves and just taking them from their homelands, traditional homelands, but it was also erasure for the Africans who were the slaves or relatives who were on the trail with them. And they say over, if there were 60,000 Cherokee who went on that trail, so this is just one of the nations, right? What I have read and heard was that over 60,000 on the trail. I think around that time they had somewhere between 20 and 30,000 enslaved people with them. So what I heard was 4,000 of the people who, African Americans who passed, saying that incorrect, over 4,000 Black people also died on the trail. I'll say it like that. So I talk a little bit about that as well. So there's erasure happening on several different levels. And even now, you can Google, 5 civilized tribes owning slaves, and lots of wonderful information will come up, but it will also show you that the rupture and the disruption happened for us as well. Okay. So moving from this moment of quote unquote rupture, and then also the historical trauma of this moment, a part of writing this book for me was trying to figure out why my family fought the way that we fought. We were Wolverines. And I don't know if anyone else in this chat or on, in this Zoom room has questions about why family members do a certain thing, but it was a constant for me because I was constantly dodging things as I grew up. And I realized, even as I was writing this too, and this is something else, I know I have a lot of writers in here, but even as you're writing, you're still discovering. Even though you have an idea, even though you have the feeling of, I know exactly the story I want to tell, there's a back door behind your story. And it's something you haven't even thought about, right? And my sister, Rochelle, who is my favorite sister, she's the sister who raised me. In my family, what happens is whoever the youngest child is, the child next to that child in age becomes the child's mom. It happened like that in my mom's family. It happened like that for my family. So my sister essentially raised me. She did my hair. My mom didn't want to do my hair. She made sure I was in bed. She fed made my cornflakes in the morning. And in the telling of the story, my sister was my back door. And what do I mean by that? She was my protector. She was the reason that I actually survived in my family. She was probably the best storyteller in my family as well. So I could hear her voice as I was writing the story, but I also knew that things she had experienced in her life were some of it I couldn't actually write about, but some of it I kind of had to write about because it was something that I hadn't addressed in my own personal healing. And so the section that I'm going to read here is when my sister and I, Rochelle, and again, just remember she's my favorite sister no matter what I say here. But we are speeding down a road in Kalamazoo, trying to take her son, my nephew, his clothes, because my nephew doesn't want to work at Burger King anymore. And so this is what we're trying to accomplish. And I'm sorry. Another part of the story is this is also a moment when I'm home for my aunt's funeral, and I'm gonna read from here. Okay, I was the tattletale, so Rochelle couldn't get into nothing Mama would know about later. I waddled after Rochelle all over the east side, head down, mostly in a book. Rochelle, a beautiful, beautiful woman, Thick black hair pulled into a bun, wide gap-toothed smile, with a single dark shadow that twinkled in her mouth like the North Star. Her heart was as big as Michigan. She didn't have a chance. She should have listened to her dreams. Not the bad dreams, but the good ones. Not the dreams where the monsters chased her down, but the dreams of her being famous, a well-off cosmetologist, being called her nickname, Hollywood, and living there too. But that hadn't happened. My sister was instead a recovering addict. How's your boyfriend? She fiddles with the lighter in the car. What's his name? Who? I suck my teeth. This sister's about to be single again. He ain't man enough. How's your husband? Who? Girl, that shit done come and gone. He can't handle all this. Honey, you crazy as all get out. We burst into nervous laughter. Our relationships frayed. Our lives tattered. But it feels good, like old times. Rochelle protected me as much as she could when we were growing up. And though our family possessed tremendously effective, inquisitive-like tormenting skills, our only true inheritance, she quietly ushered me through my own 30-yard dash as a teenage alcoholic, the summer before I left home after high school, without a word to Mama. Rochelle would break someone's face for me. Now, I wish I could protect her like that. Sister Floozy, sweat beads mowed down her brown face. Here it comes. I don't want the laughing star Rochelle to fade out. I felt her absence in so many ways in Los Angeles, missed her, especially when I wanted someone beat up. She was everyone's favorite sister and friend who had and would give you her last dime swallow of pop, a cigarette. I know things have happened since we saw each other last, things she keeps locked deep inside. What am I going to do about Jason, she says. Rochelle had been immobile. I apologize. I don't know. Let him figure it out, Roach. I try to soothe and smooth out the rough creases of this moment. I can feel the wind from the storm whispering behind my ears before it hits. Shonda, she rumbles like a volcano, churning and full in its own cayenne red blood. I have given every one of y'all motherfuckers a place to stay when you needed it. I never turned anyone away, and they used me and took my shit and ate my food. It's as if she has been waiting 1,000 cold, hard years to erupt, to scream this at the top of her lungs. Her words shell out. The syllables dissolve into incinerating lava. I have taken care of all of your children. Her eyes are blazing black orbs, done everything for them, and now no one wants to take care of my son. At the end of her sentence, she breaks into heavy, racking sobs, and the car swerves. Suddenly familiar, I disconnect. I float up from my adult body and back to the dank moisture of a childhood day, the heat bubbling from the dew-drenched afternoon, lying in bed on the first day of summer, my limbs nearly wooden from excitement. I don't have to worry about my death yet. I don't have to hold a sister's membrane falling out of her ears. I don't have to keep a car on a road. A warning buzz croons in my head, and I snap back, aware that another sharp move could plow us into oncoming traffic. I know, Rochelle, slow down. I murmur, trying to talk us to the speeding limit, one eye on her purpling face, the other on passing cars. What do you think of us? I think. What do they think of us? Two Black women, one gesturing erratically, tears scalding her swollen face, and the other covertly keeping an eye on the headlights as the windows slowly fog up as if doused with smoke from a magic trick gone awry. In the accident report will be called 2 African American women dead on the scene, while my grandfather, when he died in a car crash with his ex-wife, who was white, was referred to by the reporter as Caucasian. A Caucasian man and his wife had died. No one will mention that we have American Indian, Irish, French blood. No one will mention that we are half-breeds, mixed seeds, descendants of free people of color, Black Indian. No one will honor our bloodline. So I should have warned you that there was cussing there. Huh? Yeah, apologies. Sometimes you just get into the reading of it, but we can bloop. Can we bloop that out, John? We can bloop that out. So yeah, my sister Rochelle, even when she came to one of my readings in Kalamazoo, when I went to Kalamazoo and gave a reading, and this is how much she knows that she owns me. I gave a reading and I was so afraid that something was going to happen because she's just like a beautiful, loud, and she could peel, like the gap between her teeth, she could peel out a whistle that will break a window. Seriously. And I thought, oh my goodness, she's going to do something. And so, I read, and then people were asking me questions, and someone asked me a question and my sister answered the question. She was like, that's not, so no, she didn't say that's not what happened, but she was like, yep. And da 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 da. I'm so proud of my sister. Yes, I am. just like, and that's my family. It's like, you never know, what's going to happen. Very, very lovely, unexpected moments. So I've read a lot, and I want to pause there to see if anyone has any questions. And hopefully you're still engaged and you're getting something from this in terms of, why I'm writing this story, how, I decided to incorporate the personal narrative with history because it was important, right? And I'll come back to that. But does anyone have any questions as of yet?
Not a question, Shonda, but I just have to say you had me sobbing on that last part. Seriously.
Sorry about that, but thank you.
No, it's
yeah.
okay. I love to sob.
Me too. It's a way of us getting well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was wondering, how difficult or easy was it for you to research all those generations of family, and where did you find your gold mine?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question. So my goal, it wasn't an actual gold mine. It was more seeds along the trail. Mm-hmm. So the first time in earnest that I decided to research the family history was when I went to the Kalamazoo Public Library because I knew they had a genealogy room. And how did I know this? I just happened upon it. I was always in the library, but I guess I never thought I should go into that room. And when I was an adult, so I guess I was 25 maybe, and I said I should go into this room. So this is really interesting, and I could probably write an essay on the first time I went into the room. They had like filing cabinets shoved up against each other, just books everywhere. Nothing was organized. It was just like, oh, let's just put this book in this room and like I was blowing dust off of stuff, right? And I had my daughter with me. I think she was like 5 or 6 at the time. And I'm like, you're going to help me with research, family research. And my nephew was with me as well. And so I gave them tasks. And I said, go through this section here, like the table of contents. And if you if you see any names that start with STAF, highlight that for me. So, and I was like, and you go, nephew, he's older, you go into this file cabinet and you look at the top here. And he's like, what? Look at the top. And if you see anything that's STAF or MAN, let me know. So I had them as my little researchers. And that was the first place that I found a book that talked about the quote unquote colored people. Colored is a truncated word or phrase from free people of color. A quick snippet of history. The free people of color could be the multiracial people, but in 1924, Walter Pleckert, who was the first Virginia magistrate, um, uh, and a white supremacist, a known white supremacist, uh, drew up a Racial Integrity Act. And the Racial Integrity Act essentially said all white people will be white, and anyone else who was not white would be colored. And so here's another moment of erasing the Indian tribes, erasing mixed bloods, erasing Black people in this country. Didn't matter where you came, erasing Samoans, Filipinos, Chinese, Hispanic, Mexican, Latino, Latinas, anyone who was white was colored for many, many, many years. And when you hear about the civil rights movement and the colored people, it wasn't just us. We were all fighting for Black rights because, of course, the African Americans had been enslaved in this country, traditionally degraded. Multiple things that happened: colored only, white only bathrooms and water fountains and those kinds of things. But the term colored, for some reason, came to mean became only Black people. So, okay, that was a little bit of a history sidebar. So I found a book that said the colored people of Kalamazoo. And my grandfather, Jeremiah Stafford, his son, a couple of his sons, so Jeremiah Stafford Sr. and Jeremiah Stafford Jr. And Jeremiah Stafford Jr. was known as Indian Doctor, so his entire history was there. A couple of other people. One of the Staffords was one of the first Michigan highway commissioners. Like, just so much history. So that first little moment of research happened in the genealogy room at Kalamazoo Public Library, and then I picked it up in another genealogy room probably about 10 years later in Hampton, Virginia. And there's a Hampton, Virginia Public Library on the second floor has another genealogy room. And so in that genealogy room, I was able to use Ancestry.com. I've never paid for Ancestry.com. I was able to use it. And I was also able to use FamilySearch.org, which both of those are owned by the Church of Latter-day Saints. So I would compare and contrast the information presented in both of those websites. And then I would take what I found to the state census. So I would go to like a North Carolina census. I'd go to the Virginia census. When they started the census in 1790, 1790, I think they had like 3 races. It was like white, Indian, and Black, and white, Indian, and Negro. I think that's what they were saying. And then it became different things until the I'm not going to say that, but I'm going to keep that history here. But so the state census, the counties and townships have their own state records as well. So that's a lot. But those are the places that I went to study my family history. I literally would show up at these county courthouses and ask for records. Sometimes I would get it, and sometimes they would say, "Oh, that courthouse burned down, so all those records are gone." Mm-hmm. And when I kept getting this, and I got this like 6 times, and I said, "What happened?" And so one librarian or county person said to me, she said, "Well, there's a story that the county records or registrars or whoever that person was got a call, maybe not a call, but got word that the courthouse was going to be burned down. So they should take certain documents and save those, and then other documents, leave them." So those other documents were people of color owning land and their land deeds and their birth certificates and court deeds that would say, like, someone would verbally say, "I have known Shonda Buchanan and she's owned that land over there all her life, and I knew her ancestors." But if that was burned down, if that was gone, there's no record, right? So so those were some of my research tools.
That's awesome. Thank you.
That was a lot. Any other questions? As of yet, no other questions? Because I can keep reading. Keep reading? Okay. All right. So another dilemma that I had to face with writing Black Indian was from my people, Black people saying, "Why don't you just stay Black?" And then another dilemma from another my full blood nations. A couple of people would say, "Why don't you just stay Indian? Like, why do you have to claim Black?" So I'm like, how is it that I'm caught between, like, why are we born? We should have the ability, we should have the right to claim all of our ethnicities, right? I really truly believe that that is a construct of the colonizers, and the conquer and divide. So this is a section where I'm kind of having this conversation with myself. Where's the proof? I'm constantly asked. What are you? Classmates have fingered my good hair, pointed at my toffee-hued skin. You're not really Black. One former friend told me years ago when I was 19 or 20, comparing my slender nose and skin tone to her beautiful thick features and rich cola nut skin. I knew I was not fully Black, but for her to say it like that to me set me apart from the Black race, the Black fight, the struggle of my Black people. I love my Blackness, my Africanness, my connection to Africa. I love the dopeness of our culture, our music, our artistic expression, and scientific inventions. Our culture could be appropriated, but never owned. I love and appreciate my American Indian culture in the same way. The dancing and drumming fills me with a sense of belonging. I feel blessed, not cursed, to share both. But my Aunt Catherine and her manual kin are from the old school light-skinned crew. They are the wooden splinters of the Racial Integrity Act. The darker the berry did not mean the sweeter the juice for them. Their minds were stuck in that tragic mulatto trope. Their light skin did make them better than us, than me, who got my darkness from my father's side. But if you ask any of them how and why, they probably couldn't explain it. It's equally strange and hurtful to hear some full-blood Indians make jokes about us mixed bloods. What's wrong with you? You think you know what it means to be Indian, eh? Isn't it? Maybe I don't know, but I know my history. I know Andrew Jackson had a plan for non-whites and the non-whites' possession. Andrew Jackson's plan, along with his all-white administration, was to take Indian land. A proud white supremacist who was also friends with Adolf Hitler. Walter Pleckert had a plan to keep pureblood whites pureblood, to stop intermarrying, to classify all non-white people as colored, especially mulattoes and multiracial mixed bloods. It seemed like a good plan. No wonder the rest of the nation bought it. Why not? I can see them slapping each other on the back. Why the hell not? Pleckert aimed, in essence, to erase any trace of individual tribes, tribal affiliation, and Blackness, and more significantly, to not let biracial couples' miscegenated products leak through and claim whiteness. Negro, Indian, or any of color-looking babies all became colored. Probably a few swarthy Italian babies were suddenly colored too. Eventually, Blacks and Indians bore the label, though it stuck more so for the Blacks. And the social implication of erasing hereditary lines between Blacks and Indians were as much a public policy of eradicating the Indian himself. Mulatto, Chino, Sambo, quadroon, octoroon, mestizo, red-bone, high yellow. The power of naming and renaming worked like a spade. to dig up the roots of families, nations, and entire linguistic groups and tribes, thus robbing them, us, of our identity. But that couldn't stop it. The mixing of races happened anyway. Black slaves ran away and married into a tribe, African or Indian, and birthed little half-breed mixed blood babies that were very much as any full blood, a part of the tribe. Buffalo soldiers married full-blood women and were welcomed into the tribe. Indian women and children were stolen from their homes, from riverbanks, and from villages by bushwhackers and sold into slavery, according to Black Indian slave narratives by Patrick Mingus. But they couldn't stop us. Slave masters captive American Indians to work as slaves next to Africans and mixed whites and Black slaves. Why would a slave owner bother to differentiate between a dark-skinned Indian and a mulatto slave if it was easier? Because they were property anyway, all lumped together. And I'm going to pause there. And I want to move over and give a little bit of honor to the Quakers in honor of John. With the help of sympathetic Quakers and random whites who were disgusted by slavery or disagreed with it, many of Michigan's founders of color were either cargo on or conductors of the Underground Railroad. We saved each other. We hid each other. We made babies. Yet land was always the ultimate goal of it all, and so was erasure. Erasure. Erase us for sure. And so I wanted to skip to that paragraph about the Quakers because in my research, it was really fascinating. And I think, John, we had this discussion the very first time when we had lunch over at Mount Sac. But the Roberts, when they finally decided that they didn't want to be ostracized anymore, many of my Roberts in North Carolina signed a bill or a dissent rather, because they were cracking down on free people of color. And they were like, just because you own slaves and the Indians own slaves, that doesn't mean, we like you. And the last straw for the Roberts was that they said free people of color could not carry arms in city spaces and city places. And they were like, that's ridiculous. So they sold their land, and they sold their land moving into Kentucky, Tennessee, and then Indiana. But they followed Quaker trails, not always, but they followed the Quakers as the Quakers were leaving. And I know there was a split in the Quaker church between those who owned slaves and those who did not want to own slaves. Those who did not, they were like, we're just going to get on the trail. And my free people of color were like, we're just going to follow some of the Quakers and we're going to stay close to them. And it's not as if per se that they would defend each other, but at least they had a friendly group of people to follow. And from my research, when they finally got into the Indiana area and they finally started clearing the swamplands and buying up, which was traditionally Indian land anyway, but they could trade with the Quakers because the Quakers could trade with the other white people. And once the white folks traded, the white people gave the Quakers some goods, then the Roberts could also get goods, from the Quakers. So I wanted to just honor that alliance that has happened. And we remember those ceremonies where when I say I'm Choctaw, somebody who's Irish, who has Irish blood, it too. But they said, you know what? We want to thank the Choctaw and the Cherokee. So we want to thank the Cherokee and the Choctaw for sending potatoes to Ireland when we were having the Irish famine, the famine. And so tribes, nations remember when people help each other. So I just wanted to give that. Thank you, John. Thank you to your people. All right. I'm going to read two last sections. And So I've talked about identity, I've talked about loss, I've talked about landscape and just kind of the rewriting of um, the ability, or rather the inability, to try to rewrite us, right? And to erase us. But I want to read a little bit about, and I don't know if you guys have gotten to this section, um, the Nigel section. How many people have gotten to the Nigel scene? It's on 106. If you have your your book. So a lot of what I'm talking about in my book can probably be capsulized in this moment. But I'm a writer, so we just keep writing anyway. But this section, I found out that a kid I had a crush on was white and black, and I was a mixed blood child who was poor. We grew up poor. We grew up impoverished. There were 7 of us, right? So there were like, I'm the 6th child, 4th girl child. So 3 brothers, 3 sisters, just fighting over scraps and stuff, and our home was always kind of in danger of like the lights being turned off or something happening, So it felt to me as if when I saw that this guy I had a crush on, Nigel, had this beautiful life, something in my young mind was like, why? How come I don't know he's mixed blood? Why does he have more than me? Why is it that we are poor over here, but we're mixed blood? And so I was trying to connect the dots. I was trying to figure this out. And I had to write this section because I had to implicate myself in what it meant to try to discover who you were based upon where you came from. I had a crush on Nigel since kindergarten, but he never looked at me. He only liked the white girls and Yvonne Gibson, who was light, bright, pretty. The slightly darker skinned black girls collectively knew we didn't stand a chance with him. And one day in my Curious George treks around the east side, I turned down a well-kept street I had never been on. The house was majestic to my eyes, brick and wood with manicured lawns and expertly shaped hedges. It was as if a new and improved version of my street had been magically dropped into our community, like Dorothy's house in The Wizard of Oz. My imagination knew no bounds then, and oh, look, a pretty white woman coming out of her front door, probably a fairy godmother. And oh, she's kissing a black man. He gets in his car and waves to his son, my schoolmate, Nigel Lockett. The fairy godmother was hugging Nigel now, handing him something, maybe his lunchbox. It suddenly struck me with a terrible glee that Nigel was mixed like me. Although he wasn't black and Indian, he was black and white. It was the 70s, and black power permeated the air. I was a kid, but I saw the smug pride of my brothers and sisters when they sported their afros and black power fists and ebony picks in their hair. No one wanted to be white when the fine Smokey Robinson and the Miracles oozed from car speakers as we drove around town. No one claimed to be mixed with anything when we learned to do the bump or pretended we were the Jackson 5. Black power, baby, my brothers and sisters would say in passing to their friends when coming or going. Ungawa, black power. But Nigel was white. My new knowledge gave me a terribly sweet sense of power. I had something over him. I just didn't know what it was really. The next day in class, I looked at him, unafraid, hopelessly enamored, but knowing he would never give me the time of day. And I started humming a song in my head as I added up math problems and practiced my long O's and S's and D's. D's were my favorite, and N's too. And I'm not going to say the word, but I'm going to say, as in the N word, Nigger. And I hummed until the bell rang for recess, and I sang a little of it on the playground to shock my schoolmates. Hum, 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 Nigel is an in. It had such a swell ring to it. The alliteration of the N thrilled me. I sang it in my head until after we climbed off the school bus at the end of the day and it burst from my mouth. Nigel is an Nigger. His dad is black and his mom is white. Nigel is an... He was hanging back with his friends and couldn't hear me. So it didn't matter. I sang, skipping along East Main Street towards my street, Southworth Terrace. I was giddy in my newfound knowledge that a boy I had a crush on who ignored me was not better than me. He wasn't better than any of us. I never stopped to think that it was none of my business, that maybe he was embarrassed, that his desire to keep quiet about it was for the purposes of protecting himself. I felt somehow betrayed, that I got nothing as a biracial girl and he seemed to get everything. Maybe because I knew his family had money and mine didn't. He was always clean and new looking clothes and good lunches. I did not have that. Maybe I just desperately wanted him to like me back. Maybe I was possessed. But I could not for the life of me shut up. Someone must have told him about my serenade. Nigel is coming, someone yelled. I saw a scuffle and a sea of kids parted like, the Red Sea, and he darted out of it towards me. I took off. I was scared shitless, laughing out of sheer terror for what he was going to do to me when he caught me. I was the fastest runner in my age group on my block, but Nigel was faster. I'm going to kill you, Shonda. You better shut up. He chased me and ran me down like the dog I was. For some reason, I couldn't keep the words from coming out of my mouth as I ran. Nigel is a. He caught my arm, threw me down on my back, straddled my stomach, raised his hand. He had been trained not to hit girls. He hesitated until I laughed like the dolt I was as he slapped me hard, and then for good measure, he spit in my face. I didn't care. I laughed like a big dummy. Kids are cruel. I was cruel. He was cruel too. At that moment, calling him the worst insult I could think of was instinct. But later, years and years later, I realized he hated his black-white self a little too, more than he hated me. And maybe as much as I disliked myself for not knowing what or who we were, because we didn't look Africa black. Our skin tone incriminated us. Our high cheekbones and our spongy hair set us apart. I was light brown. My sisters and brothers were mostly high yellow, and my mother was as translucent as a star. Me and Nigel weren't what our history books termed the N-word, black slaves in a cotton field, but somehow we were tainted with the heritage of that word. My mom hadn't really taught me how to be proud of our blackness. The multiracial and Indian part, yes, but being proud of my blackness, that I had to learn. So it happened just like that. It did. Someone asked me this question the other 2 readings ago, and they were like, so has Nigel Lockett, I put his last name in here, and they're like, did Nigel ever contact you? I was like, the light bulb went off like, oh, no. I don't know if he ever, read this, or if someone in Kalamazoo, if they were like, Nigel, you're in her book. But I think if he read this, he could see my apology. He could see that I was like, I was such a terrible kid to give to you a thing that systematic racism and the racism in the infrastructures of our country had given to me, and it was intrinsic. I didn't even know it, and maybe there are people out there who still don't know it. But that word, and we know the weight of that word in history, right? But for that to come out of my mouth, it was like, yeah, like trying to just do him the most damage. But you don't realize, and there's a thing that we talk about in American Indian culture, is what you say comes back to you. And it was almost like I was trying to hurt myself while I was hurting him at the same time and didn't know it. Self-sabotage. So yeah, that's one section, and I'm going to end with this because I know we've got some other cues, but I'm going to end with this piece here. So I'm going to truncate a little bit of my my journey into. Sometimes I call it learning, becoming Indian. Learning to be Indian. But for me, when I finally started doing ceremony in the mountains of California, a friend of mine took me to the sweat lodge, my first sweat lodge. And the first time that I was standing on the outside of the sweat lodge, I was like, what is that? He's like, it's a place where we pray. And my Christian background was like, my mama don't pray in that. Like, I don't know what's happening right there, but that's not what we do. I didn't grow up. My daddy was a Baptist preacher. I mean, I heard about a sweat lodge. I heard about it. And I was just afraid. I was scared. And wouldn't you know, it started raining. And this is how some things work. It started raining cold rain. The fire was going in the pit. And I knew it was warmest in that sweat lodge. And I was supposed to go in. And so I was like, just do it. And when I went into that sweat lodge for the first time, this had to have been, my daughter was 9. So what was that, 23, 24 years ago? I knew I was home. Like I felt all my ancestors, all my relations, as we say. And the Lakota way that you say it is matakwiyase, homatakwiyase. It's like I'm honoring all my relations. I'm bringing all my ancestors with me to this place of prayer. And I've never left. I've never left the sweat lodge, and I've only gone on to become a powwow dancer, a women's traditional dancer, learning the ways, trying to be incredibly respectful of a culture that I wasn't raised in, but I knew was mine as well. I learned that respect for our culture in these ways is the most important ingredient: humility and respect. I learned that sometimes the hard way, and sometimes, not so hard. So I've participated in some other ceremonies too. Been blessed and privileged to be able to see the power of these ways. And I'm going to end with this section called A Good Sweat. I crawl around the sweat lodge in a circle on the hard, cold ground, cutting my hands and knees on both the loose rocks and the protruding stones embedded in the earth. I have known some of these rocks for over 9 years. When I settle on my haunches, excuse me, I recognize them like cousins, the hard rise of their shoulders lodged in my softness. I pull my knees close to my chest, circle my arms around my legs, and wait for the warmth of the first stone to emanate heat in the pit. Usually, I sit in the western door or section of the lodge. But this time when I come to the mountains, both Friday and Saturday, I am closer to the north door. And in the next day, and the next day in the women's lodge, I'm right next to the sweat leader, a Hispanic woman, an elder with beautiful, fiery, but cautious cat eyes. And I can tell from the way with which she talks to us in the darkness that she has been sweating for years. This is her way too. I noticed with trepidation that I kept getting closer and closer to her. Before I came here this weekend, I had said I wanted to learn the ways of this ceremony more thoroughly, participating as a disciple one day leading my own sweat lodge, not just someone who prayed. I had said I wanted to learn to keep fire. And eventually, when I was ready, possibly older, pour water in each direction to honor our ancestors. But it is a lifetime commitment, working with the fire and the water and the rock people. I don't know if I'm ready or if I will ever be ready. It will be hard, something like writing, to always have to ask myself, am I doing it right? Yeah. So, thank you all. I'm so incredibly grateful. So I've read a lot, you all. I talked a lot. Questions. What questions do y'all have? Thank you. Yes, Andrew.
I wanted to say that this was fantastic, absolutely wonderful.
Thank you.
One of the things that was really interesting when you were reading about the Nigel section, and you talked about how some of the things that we say out of our mouths come back to us, and we do terrible things. But a lot of that reminded me of similarities in the LGBT community, where you kind of say these things when you're younger, don't maybe not know about, or you do know about yourself, and we have these inner worlds of our own, and we don't know what anyone else is going through, especially at that young of an age. And just kind of seeing the transition of the child mind and the adult mind kind of going together, it's just fascinating, wonderful.
Yeah. No, thank you for pointing that out. I knew I needed to keep that temporal transition, as we call it in the literary device world, but I wanted that temporal transition to be like a fluid thing that happened, because Joy Harjo does this as well. I mentioned Joy Harjo in my workshop, but her past, present, and future flow together, and so I wanted in this book, I wanted that sense that the past, present, and future coexist. And so a part of being able to tell that story was a story from my adult mind, moving into that child mind, blending a little bit of history, because history is a thing that James Baldwin says, as much as we live in history, history lives in us. And then I had to come out of that, as an adult. So so I knew I was doing a lot of things in that moment.
Yeah, I think it's just, there's so much in here, because there's, like you said, we're in this moment, and we have all the stuff behind us that we might not even know about, that's influencing everything that's going on now, and it's just wonderful. I can't wait to get the book now. I'm ready for it.
Yay. I'm excited, right? For the back door. You can't wait for the back door. Yes. Other questions? Yes.
Shonda, it's just something that I kind of struggle with, but I also wonder how people come to their decisions. That, I'm sure in your book, you use the actual word that you now call the N-word. But I'm wondering how in the reading of it now, you decide to say the N-word instead of the word. And then I noticed, it was really beautiful and flowing the way you would say, Nigel, we all knew what you meant at that point, and that was fine. But it's just something I'm curious about, because, as someone who writes, I just believe in being authentic, and sometimes the authentic is the ugly.
Yeah. I didn't read it here. My mind said this is being recorded. And then my mind also said, do you want this, like the recording of you using the N-word played over and over and over again? So my mind just kind of stopped me at that moment. And then also I was like, wow, I already cussed. Is that too much? So I was like, I've already said, MF. And so my mind halted me. When I give readings, it depends on the audience. So sometimes if I'm in a college atmosphere, and I know that like young people, multiracial, group of folks, Black, white, Asian, American Indian, I'm like, okay, they probably say this word anyway, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that was the decision that I made right now at the time.
And just if I may add on to that, you know, so the book that I've written being about an interracial love story, but from the early 1970s. And in my writing group, there were a few times where I used various terms, and someone in the group who was quite a bit younger would say, "Oh, you know, you can't say the word ghetto because that's a loaded word, you know." And I said, and the other person closer to my age said, "But that's what we said back then. And if I change it to something else, then it isn't authentic to 1972."
Yeah. So then you have to say that in your writing. You just explain it.
Okay.
That's the caveat. That's the piece of we didn't know any better.
Right.
This is it. Now this is a term as a white woman. If I use this word, I will be looked at in an odd way, you know. But you just have
Right.
to explain it. That's a
Right.
part of writing that a lot of, particularly in memoir, that we don't think about how. I'm sorry. Sometimes we don't think about what our upbringing or how we were raised to say some things could be offensive to other people.
Mhm.
I grew up saying Indian. I didn't grow up saying American Indian or Native American. That
Mhm.
wasn't, you know. And I choose when I'm in my when I give lectures to say American Indian or Indigenous or First Peoples. But when
Right.
we're in our own communities, we say Indian. You
Right.
know, in our
Yeah.
ceremonies, we say, you know, don't make fun of these Indian ways. These are our ways, you know.
Right.
But in the writing of it, you have to explain it.
Yeah.
And multiple times too. So no one says,
Well,
you know,
and what's a little troubling is if I explain it right there in the middle of the text, then it takes you out of the moment. And so I'm wondering if some of that should be explained in the foreword or the afterword or somewhere else.
there's a way to do it. You can use some kind of a symbol. You can use silence. You can use a pause, right? Uh, um, there's a way to begin a touchy scene with some kind of a, I didn't know that this was about to happen, or my
Mm,
grandfather's ways had slid into me and I didn't even know,
mm,
you know?
mhm.
And then there's a way, like in the moment, there's some kind of a, we call it, what's that? So I'm saying symbol, but there's another word.
Right.
It's like a
A
mnemonic
disclosure.
device. Say it again.
You can always provide a disclosure to, you know, this part of the, you know, the script is going to be a little more sensitive, and
Mhm.
language that was used during this time, and just paint the picture so your audience could follow along without being so sensitive.
That's good. Yeah. Motif is the word I was looking for and I couldn't get it. So
Right. Right.
yeah. So there's a way to do it though. Yeah. You and that actually in the Nigel scene, I do that in multiple places. I own up to the fact that I was just a little terrible kid, you know, with I'd inherited a thing that I didn't even know the weight of it. And so,
Right.
and that's what that whole scene was talking about. So you can talk about what you inherited and you didn't even know it.
Right.
Yeah. Other questions, other questions. Yeah, I see it. Is there a question in the chat?
We,
Oh,
we, we are running out of time, so
oh,
maybe
okay.
one, two.
Mm.
One last question. I see Andrew again. Is that okay? Can we go with Andrew?
Yeah, I
Okay.
wanted to, this is more kind of on the research, and it's just something that was interesting me is when you were looking through the census records, did you find multiple census records for your ancestors? Oh, you got muted.
You're
Yes.
muted.
Yes, sorry.
Okay.
So what I started doing, because I did find multiple records on ancestry.com, I'd find one branch, and then on familysearch.org, I'd find one branch. I'd find one set of records, and then familysearch.org would give me a second set of records. And so I made it kind of my mission to to dig as deep as I could to everyone who was represented on that list. So if I had like a Stafford's 15 kids, and if one section said 15 kids and one section said 14 kids, and I'm like, okay, who's that 15th child? It was my grandfather that I was missing. So I would just go to all of the census records to see who had been born when. And then when I finally got like skipped the census record, then it was like, that's my grandfather was born here. So he actually is a part of this family. So I was doing a lot of just digging into each of the brothers and sisters too, to see who was related to whom, if there were like repetitions of who was related to whom, just to like certify that these actually were my people and my family. So yes, I did find multiple sets.
And the kind of a follow-up on that is, in those records, did their race change?
Yes. Yeah.
That is
So,
really fascinating.
Is that happening with you? Or have you researched some of your family?
No, I haven't done any research, but I was listening to a podcast and they were talking about how they would follow people, and every 10 years their race would change sometimes depending on where they lived. And I just wanted to see if that happened in your family, because it's so fascinating. Because
one of my great grandfathers, yes, his first his World War II record said Indian, and then after that, Indian, mulatto, colored, white. So one of my predecessors basically disappeared from the Indian race and became white. Even though people still knew who he was. Yeah.
It's just, and that kind of goes into that erasure too, because sometimes these people would erase themselves and their ethnicity just because it was so hard.
Yep. We had paper genocide, so we call that part paper genocide, where you would call someone a different name on the census until you smooth them all out to be that colored piece. But then also we could, and I call it disappearing for survival reasons, right? So you wanted to disappear in order to feed your family, in order to not be ostracized or discriminated against. And as long as the darker skinned cousins didn't say anything, you could continue to marry, and you could marry yourself out of the race.
Yeah.
And it's hard because Imitation of Life is one of the first movies to really talk about that. I don't know. Yeah, right. Where the quote unquote help, the dark skinned lady had this light skinned daughter. And I mean, one of the terrible moments for the child is when her dark skinned mother came to school to find her. And she was like, that's not my mom. And she disappeared in society. That has happened a lot. And I mean, again, it's, you know, it's basically, it's a moment where you see how insidious racism is in our country, in our society, that you have to do the paper genocide. The paper genocide forces us to discriminate against ourselves and to practice colorism on ourselves. The colorism, the hatred, the self-hatred, forces us to practice violence in our families. I mean, there's just such a generational traumatic moment, you know, from the first time where people, you know, came to this culture. We just celebrated Thanksgiving. You know, some people celebrated it, some of us didn't. You know, but you know, when those first Pequot, you know, the 700 Pequot, you know, were murdered, and so there's lots of history that I'm, you know, that goes into the feeling of we have to reclaim and celebrate. We have to name what happened, and then know that we are thriving, you know, in our lives, and with our histories, you know. And so a part of this Black Indian, when I give these talks, I really want people to know, I know the past, I know the history, but I'm also thriving, you know, in who I am, in the knowledge of who I am, and all my nations, all my relations, as we say, Matakwiyase, you know, all of them. So yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for that.
Thank you so much, Shonda. This is absolutely wonderful reading. So
thank you guys. I really appreciate it. I'm grateful. I'm hoping that you guys got something out of it. I'm contactable. My website is myfirstlastname.com. Hit me up on Instagram, and I hope to see you all. I hope to see your writing in the future.
Thank you.